This week I got some paint on the Harley saddlebags as well as getting the crankshaft back in the old Fordson tractor block. Saturday I spent the day at Fall Carlisle with one of my past graduates, Joe Curate, one of his friends. And then Sunday I was at a motorcycle swap meet up in Maryland, so I've got some footage of that to share with you, so hope you enjoy that. Some good news to share is that sometime in November, near the middle to the end, we hope to have our Auto 3s back in the lab doing some work, and I'll be able to film them and show you what they've been doing, because I know they've been excited to get back in the building, and I've definitely been excited to have them back in here. So please stay tuned with the episodes in the coming weeks, and hopefully you'll be able to see those guys back at work. With the dye powder on the saddlebags, we can set to wet sanding and we get ready to paint. Many of you have seen this before, but this really gives you a clear picture of what we're looking at here. So in wet sanding the top of the saddlebag, this part here is finished. It's nice and smooth with 400 grit. The center here is more of where we're just now getting into the sanding, and then over here we haven't touched that at all. So this is what it looks like before we get to this point. And that's what we're trying to do, and that's the reason for using wet sanding and blocking with a dye powder, so we can make sure that we're perfectly flat before the paint goes on. I'm not using any special stands to paint these saddlebags, but I do have them sitting upright because I just want to put a little bit of blue around this top edge so that there's no missing blue when I go to put everything together. So I'm going to put a little bit of blue there, very little bit, and then I'm going to turn them upside down. Once they've dried, then I'll be able to get everything else painted and then get ready to lay on the white. The tops are looking good, and I'm putting the last coat on the bags right now. Here's the design laid out and taped, and I masked both of the pieces together. So now what I can do is separate the two and paint them separate, knowing that they're going to line up when I put it all back together. I'm masking off the second one to try to duplicate the first one. That's the tricky part. I've got the top laid here. You have me put the two pieces together so that I can get my lines straight where they when I take them apart. So what I've done is once I've got this perfect, I just gave myself a little bit extra. I'm going to push that down tight, lift the lid up a little bit, and then tuck it under. And then I've got my line to bring the next one down to the bottom half of the bag. And then we'll continue trying to duplicate what was on the other side. This is how it all begins. I lay the tapes down, get the overlaps between the two pieces, and then begin making the design. I know it doesn't look like much now, but we're going to hopefully end up with that, and that could actually look just as confusing. That's why you need to have a lot of patience, a lot of quiet in my case, and be focusing on what parts you want to be white, and then get it all masked off and spray it. I'm going to show you laying this last piece on. It's not going to be as difficult or intricate as what I've done earlier, where I really had to focus and concentrate on getting these pieces cut, where I overlaid the tape, and you have to be really gentle to cut just enough till it gets into the tape, but not enough that it gets into the paint. But this part's going to be easy because we can just live with the overlap that's already there, and then bring it around. I'm going to take and drop it like this, and we're going to go from sharp and follow this contour, bring it up. Alright, see, my gap's not quite right there. I don't really like that. And again, like I think I've shown you in other things that I've masked, you can just pull it back up and go right back to it. Keep following it around. It's doing the same thing again. Now I can dip this and catch the rest of it like that. I like that a lot better. Then I'm going to start gradually thinning it down. I'm looking at the other one over there and trying to get it as close as I can, but the nice thing is, as I've said before, can't see two sides of the bike at the same time. But also, since this is being done by hand and free-handed, I want them to be different. It's going to be more unique that way. And if I really cared about it, I would make a template, which would be pretty easy to do. But I don't really care for that. All four pieces of the saddlebags are masked off and ready to spray. I'm going to cut the air pressure down considerably, as well as my fluid. Just enough to come out to cover that blue. I don't want to get too crazy with it and have too much overspray getting on other parts of it. I'm going to do all this in one coat because that's all it's going to need to cover that blue. Again, I don't want to overdo it and have too sharp of an edge, because when I go to pull the tape away, it could actually it could mess up the line. So we're going to be really gentle, put in just enough to cover, and then we'll let it dry and unmask it. The white's kicked off, everything's unmasked. It's time to put on some clear. All the pieces are cleared, and they don't look too bad. The design isn't exactly what I had in mind in the beginning, or even what I drew, but it's also upside down. I think it's going to look okay, especially when the chrome trim goes around it, but we'll see. If it doesn't, I'll paint them again. A lot goes into the thought process of coming up with a design, especially in an area that's that small. So you start with just some things that you know, and then you start working on things that you just try to make up as you go along. Some things don't look good, some things do. And here's some other ones I drew, trying to eventually get to where I wanted to be. These started looking a little closer to what I was after. And eventually we end up with the design that we actually picked. So it's just a matter of just drawing and making lines and scribbles until you eventually come up with the design that you like. After getting all this together with the chrome pieces, I can see that's not going to look as good as I wanted it to. Sometimes things look better on paper than they do when you actually paint them. But I already have figured out a new design. I've measured everything of how I want to do this. I'm going to try to keep some of this here, but then incorporate the line going straight between these two bars. So I've got everything measured out really well. Now all I just need to do is wet sand all this down to get it ready to reshoot the blue over that. The nice thing is by keeping the measurements for the front, I'm not going to have to redo the tops because the tops came out nice. So anyway, I'm going to again get this wet sanded down, get the blue reshot over the white, and then lay the white out, and then I think it's going to look a lot better. What's different about this wet sanding process is not only do I need to wet sand enough to make sure that the next paint and clear stick, but also I need to get it down far enough so that you don't feel this ridge anymore. If you can see there at the end of my finger along that white stripe, you can see a dark blue line. That's the blue line where I haven't gotten to yet as for sanding. If I don't take that all the way down, the paint and clear will stick, but I'll always be able to see that stripe through the blue, even with the next white that I'm going to put over top of it. So I need to make sure that I wet sand and get it all out flat so that all the dark blue is out, and then that way when I paint back over these stripes, we won't be able to tell that they were ever there. I'm ready to reshoot the blue. I've got the white all blocked down and cleaned. We're going to cover up these two sides for sure, and then we're going to be ready to lay on the new white stripe. So I don't have to reshoot the lids. I'm going to keep this mark here. This top part and the width of this matches what's on the lid. So I'm just going to mask off that little bit there, like I did on this one. And then that way, after everything is blue, I'll know exactly where the width of the white needs to be so that when the lids go on, it'll match as if I'd painted them together like I did last time. I'm stopping the video here because both of these need to be reshot. You'll see that in just a minute. But I wanted to let you know that I kept the footage in before this because it's still good information on how things are done and how stripes are laid. But I am going to have to redo both of these, and you're about to see why right now. Sometimes, no matter how well you plan, things go wrong. So I've got lifting on this saddlebag, and I have to wet sand that out later and reshoot it. And on this one, when I was doing my masking to do the spray, I'm glad this happened. I did this side a little too long, so when I lifted up the tape, it pulled here. So I'm going to have to wet sand these down again, repaint them, and start all over. Since things went south with the Harley saddlebags this week, I figured we'll go ahead and put the crankshaft in the 23 Fordson block. We're going to go ahead and get the caps off of this thing and put the crankshaft in after we clean everything up. We had everything shimmed correctly the first time when we put the crank in, so it should just be a matter of cleaning, putting some oil in, setting the crank in, and torquing it down. And then we should be okay to start putting the pistons and rods back in. The caps are loose, so I'm going to take and set these down in the exact position where they would be in the correct order as well. And I'm taking the shims off from each one and putting them in the exact location too. It is really important that we do that and get it shimmed correctly so we get the proper clearance between the crankshaft and the babbitt journal so that we get enough oil in there to lubricate it. And speaking of the shims, in getting this set correctly before, my son McLean and I, we spent a lot of time getting it perfect. We had to, in a couple of instances, take a Dr. Pepper can and get it cut and punched so that we could use it as a shim. And that's perfectly fine. The block doesn't care. What's most important is making sure that we get the clearance again so that we have an oil bath to go around the crankshaft as it's spinning in the engine. So we'll get these other two off, keep the shims and everything in order, then we'll be ready to clean up and set the crankshaft in place. This engine doesn't utilize a conventional oil pump like we have today. What it does is it relies on the oil bath that the crankshaft would sit in, but also as it spins around, the oil would come in through these holes from the top side because you are looking at it upside down. So the oil would come in from the top in these holes here, and then along that groove, and that would help to lubricate the crankshaft. So it's all done just by almost like a small Briggs & Stratton engine would do. And the caps also have grooves cut in them that I'll show you later, and that's how it retains some of the oil so that it can keep it lubricated all the time. This is a mixture of petroleum jelly and a little bit of oil. I'm going to put that into the babbitt area before I set the crankshaft in place. The reason I choose to use something like this other than oil like you normally would is because it's going to be several months, maybe even another year before this thing is actually started. So I want to make sure that there is lubrication that's going to stay there the entire time. This won't go anywhere. It'll stay in that area, so it'll get it started, and then the oil can take over from there. So we're just going to put a light coat in the babbitt area of each one of the journals. With the top halves of the babbitt area is lubricated, it's time to set the crankshaft in place. There we go. Now it's a matter of getting the caps cleaned, getting the shims wiped off good, putting those in place, torquing it down, and we should be ready to start putting pistons in. I might be going off each one of these shims before setting them in place because any dirt or oil will throw off the clearance between the crankshaft and the journal. So you want to make sure that everything is nice and clean before putting the cap on and torquing it down. Now I'll get the cap cleaned off really well, making sure that the oil groove is cleaned out. Inside of these, there is a groove cut into the babbitt and the cap here that allow oil to sit in there as well, so it will keep the crankshaft lubricated. So we'll set this in place very gently over the shims. And the other thing I want to point out is that these bolts have a hole drilled in the head of each one. Now the reason for that is we will wire tie these together once it's all torqued down. Because what happens is the vibration could cause the bolts to back out. So they'll wire these together so that if one tries to loosen, it forces another one to be tight. So they're constantly basically tightening each other as it's going, as it's running. We had to do one of the bolts. One of the bolts was messed up, so we had to replace one. And we actually had to cross drill the head of this bolt. It was a bit of a challenge. Definitely want to make sure that you have a drill press to go in nice and straight. But then that'll allow us to wire tie all these together like they did from the factory, and it'll last a very long time, hopefully. The center cap is in. The bolts are pretty tight. I don't have them torqued yet, but I've got them snugged pretty good, and the crank is moving freely, so that's a good sign. We'll do the same thing with the two outer caps, and then we'll get them torqued down. And like I said, that should finish off the crankshaft installation, and we can get busy putting the rest of the short block back together. That's two main journals in place, one more to go. All three of the main caps are on and snug down. We just need to do a final torque. The crankshaft is spinning freely. So next week, hopefully we'll have a couple of pistons put in it. overall show, there was a few highlights. Here's a Good Humor ice cream truck that was actually for sale. This is one of the better cars that we saw that was there, but mostly the show is about bits and pieces, people selling stuff and companies selling things for people who are actually building cars. This is a Glazeret truck advertising their paint materials. It actually has a 7.3 Ford diesel stuffed in it. And the next one was the one I thought was the best car there. This is based on a Ford Ranchero, but it's Lincoln's version of the Ranchero. Supposedly pretty rare. Doesn't mean it's worth a lot, but I thought it was pretty cool. The next day I was at a Maryland swap meet and I saw this thing in there. I didn't take this video because I thought it looked so nice. It's quite the contrary. For me, it's like just when you think people can't make something look uglier, something like this shows up. I mean, I know there's a market for something like this, but I don't know. I think this thing is pretty horrible looking in my opinion, but there you go. Next time on Bulldog Builds, we'll have a little more of that Fordson tractor block put together, and we'll have both of the saddlebags repainted for the Harley. See you next week.